Hello, this is episode number 6 of Revive and Thrive, and I'm your host, Joshua Blum, and today's episode is brought to you by the letter F. There's a lot of different things I could have chosen to represent F, and F is, for things like family and finances, lots of different things, but F for this episode is actually freedom. And it's because all those other things kind of come back to the central core of freedom. It's interesting because burnout is kind of like an imaginary pair of shackles on your arms and your legs. And it's one of those things that holds you back and saps your energy and your will to do things, and you may not necessarily even realize it. That's why I say it's like invisible or imaginary, but it's really there. It's a little bit like when people talk about the symptoms of, say, something like major depressive disorder. I'm a psychiatrist by training, and so, I obviously see this a lot. And, throughout history, mental health conditions, because you cannot see them and touch them, you just sort of see the effects of them, have been, stigmatized and so forth, for a whole host of reasons. But in the symptoms, if you look at them, typically are things like anergia, lack of energy, sort of a slowing down, and anhedonia, loss of pleasure in things. And even though burnout is not the same as depression, there are elements which are similar. And people often will describe, in certain instances, they don't have a lot of energy or will to do things or motivation to do things. Especially if it's, say, work-related or whatever. They may have not total loss of pleasure, universally, but loss of pleasure in their work, or just less, maybe like a dyshedonia, if that's a word. So there's some features, but I think what we're going to be talking about specifically in this episode is trying to figure out ways of creating freedom, not by adding more, because when you talk about these things, let's say, well, do more, exercise more, take more vacations, say no more. All those things are all important. But one other thing to think about is that how can you actually do a little bit less and have more? And it's kind of like good writing. If you ever taken any classes in writing, remember back to high school or whatever, good writing doesn't have a lot of stuff in it. The constant thing with editing is to eliminate. There's a book actually written by Stephen King, who maybe is not always the best at doing this because his books tend to be really long, but it's called On Writing. And one of the first things he says is eliminate excess words. And so you want to eliminate things in your life in parallel that lead to things not going as smoothly as you would like. Now that's obviously that's easier said than done, but elimination of things, whether it's physical things or figurative things, is important for us to think about. If you remember back to, say, medical school or intern year, you remember how long it probably took you to do things? I think my very first internal medicine rotation, intern year, I was probably working like 110 whatever hours a week or whatever. But by the end of the rotation, it was more reasonable. It was still a lot, but it was more reasonable. And a lot of it was because in the very beginning, because I didn't know what I was doing, because I was just a couple months out of medical school, you make a lot of mistakes. You have a lot of inefficiencies that just gums up the works and makes us very inefficient. So it's kind of like the same thing. I'm not a Buddhist, and I'm not here to espouse any sort of Buddhist principles or anything like that. But if you look at Buddhism, it's kind of interesting because it's all about, they take this attitude that life is suffering. Don't necessarily agree with that 100%, but a lot of what gets us in trouble, they say, comes from misplaced desire and ignorance and fear. Those three central things. And if you look at a lot of Buddhists like pictures and things like that, like a wheel of life, Tibetan wheel of life, those kind of things like that, you will see that imagery often depicted symbolically in various ways. So freeing yourself from things like various kinds of desires, addictions, and so forth can really help eliminate a lot of the suffering in your life, some of which can contribute to this feeling of burnout. Now, for some people, that's going to be, a lot easier said than done. Some of those things are things that maybe by choice. You may know that certain things are habit forming, but you indulge in them anyway just because you like them. For a lot of physicians, for example, work in particular, and the need to be needed, I guess you can say, is a kind of addiction in itself. That's one of those things that, in particular, we're going to be talking about that in a future episode, but you're recognizing that, some of what we do comes from this desire to be appreciated and needed. And when that doesn't happen, that's a huge lead in to burnout. One of the things that sometimes happens a lot with folks is that they get into this pattern of doing more and more and more and getting more and more frustrated and resentful that people don't seem to recognize their efforts. It could be family, children, spouse, whatever. It could be administration. It could be, a great example would be the Doctor's Day posts they're funny. I participate in them too. I think they're hilarious, but they're also representative too, right? Because people will post these different things that from this symbolic day that's basically meaningless, right? But they'll say, like, look, I didn't get anything. We got an email, full of meaningless platitudes. We got, a free ice cream or something like that. It doesn't recognize the work that you put in, right? And so it feels false, and it's representative of some of the underlying resentment sometimes people can feel in those situations where they're giving and giving, but they feel like they're not getting enough in return. And interestingly enough, money is not necessarily going to be a motivating factor. There has to be something else for most people. So again, it comes back to our clarity of purpose. This is back for episode 1. Clarity of purpose or why we're doing what we're doing is incredibly important because it helps to streamline our thinking in such a way that we can start to ignore some of these things that may get to us. When we're clear on what we want, it makes it a lot easier to not be pushed around by other people or by situations, to feel like we're a little bit more in control of who we are and what we want out of life. So sometimes you have to set things up with that in mind. I'll just give you a little example. If you've ever seen the movie Karate Kid 2, so this is the original one from the 80s, and I remember watching this as a kid and being very disappointed that it had not one but 2 love stories in there. Oh, the audacity. But actually watching as an adult, it's a little bit different. Especially the ending. There's an ending scene where the main story is Daniel-san and his teacher, Mr. Miyagi, are going to Okinawa. So Mr. Miyagi has not been back to Okinawa for a long time. Now he's a childhood rival there who is there and is a successful businessman, and he wants to level the village that they all grew up in. I think he wants to hand it over to developers to make money. When Mr. Miyagi gets back there and he finds out that that's the plan, he obviously wants to stop it. His childhood rival, I think they were fighting over a woman or something like that, still wants to fight him. Mr. Miyagi is like karate is just for self-defense. I'm not going to fight over some pissy contest or something from a long time ago that's meaningless. Interestingly enough, eventually he does agree to the fight, but on one condition. He says that, okay, fine, I will do it, but only on the condition that whatever happens, win or lose, the village goes free. And his rival accepts. So there's a little conversation that happens after that with Daniel and him. He's like, Daniel's like, well, what are you doing? I mean, this is not just a tournament. This is like big stakes. I mean, you could die. And, Mr. Miyagi says, it doesn't matter. At this point, I get what I want, no matter what I want, no matter what happens, which is that the village goes free. That's more important. So, for him, his particular goals were such that the outcome of what was going to happen in this particular confrontation was irrelevant. He had a bigger goal in mind. And so when we're clear on what we want, it often makes it a lot easier to deal with some of these things that come at us. Now, it doesn't have to be that extreme of an example, but our focus really determines, where we go. And so I would say, when we're looking about actionable steps, one thing you can do, and this is, again, just suggestions, just things to think about, but if you think about all the different areas of life that are important to you, I would list them down. Think about basic stuff, eating, sleeping, exercise, sexual activity, and I would think about work things. I would think about hobbies, all these different aspects of life. And you might want to rate them, maybe like on a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that. So you can a little bit more objectively say, how much of a hassle is this particular area of your life? Or you could do it the other way, which is like, how much joy or pleasure do you get out of these different areas of life? It doesn't really matter. But what you want to see is like basically a number for each domain. And that way you can see a little bit more visually and objectively where there are areas that are lacking. So the whole idea is that we'll talk about this in a future episode, but imagine all the things in your life are a wheel and everything on it is a spoke. And so in order for the wheel to rotate smoothly, all the spokes have to be more or less the same length. And so if there's an area of imbalance, that's an area that either you really like doing or is really an area of trouble. But either way, it may eat up time from something else. When we're talking about trying to limit things that take away our freedom, in particular, pay attention to stuff that you find yourself gravitating towards you don't really want to be doing. Maybe you drink too much alcohol. Maybe you spend too much money on things that don't really give you a whole lot of long-term joy. Maybe, a lot of money goes toward things like frivolous purchases that other people want you to do, get involved with. Maybe it's kids or family or whatever, but really they're on to the next thing before you know it. It's not meaningful long-term. And so if you can identify those, you can start to say like, okay, this is an area that I need to, or I would like to focus on. Have you ever heard of, there's something called the Pareto principle in economics, and, it often gets thrown around in business and all that kind of stuff like that. But it's this idea that 80% of your headache comes from about 20% of your actual work. If you think about this in medicine terms, we all inherently know that there are some patients that are very difficult, but it's probably not a majority. So it might be like 10% of your patients, but that generates 90% of your work. So if you can at least identify who those are, then you have a good chance of saying like, okay, there's something more that I need there. Do I need more help? Do I need more? Is there a skill gap there that I don't quite, haven't identified? That sort of thing. So look for those areas in your life, those areas of large imbalance where you're generating a lot of work, but the payoff is very little, or it takes up a huge amount of time and it's not something that you want to be doing. I would look for that in your professional life as well, because there may be areas there that you can streamline. And I wouldn't negate little basic things like eating and sleeping, time to exercise, sexual activity. We probably should do a whole episode just on sex, but because it's an area that, I would say as a psychiatrist, so many problems come from very basic things like sleep and sex and things like that people kind of hope are going to go well in their life, but don't for whatever reason. They're basic because they're biological and they're sort of necessities in various ways. It doesn't necessarily mean they're simple. In some martial arts lineages, the basic stuff is the very first thing you learn. It doesn't mean it's just the easy stuff. It's just the most important thing. It's like if all else fails, you have that. So the basic stuff, these biological needs, don't negate that as being important. I remember, over the pandemic, I made a decision that I was going to take an hour for lunch. Whatever happened, I was going to take an hour. I was going to, not do any work, not schedule any patients. I would go off to my car and sit there, take off my N95 and eat lunch. And I would not be bothered by anybody. And it was a small thing, but it made a huge difference at the time. And so don't negate these little things that, sometimes can make a big, big difference long-term in your quality of life. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is, if you can have enough of those little things, they can actually add up to a lot. So look for those things, post those things in the comments, things that you find over the time have helped you. And we will talk to you guys next time.